Exploring disenfranchisement. What is disenfranchisement? How does it affect people? Which group of people are most affected? Where does disenfranchisement stem from, and what constructs does it defy or support? Disenfranchisement is a state or feeling of being deprived of a right or privilege or opportunity. Often shows forms of not being represented in political policies in the system as a whole. Fundamentally, the act of being disenfranchised in American history strikingly affects Black Americans, women, citizens who have been previously or are now incarcerated, and the LGBTQ community. Disenfranchisement is socially acceptable, which creates a repeated cycle of discrimination and inclusive behavior. There is negative social constructs against Blacks, women, and other minorities. In particular, Blacks in regards to the youth in the school-to-prison pipeline, and women in context of their health and not having a right or proper vote in how their bodies are viewed, accepted, and taken care of from a medical standpoint. The targeted population theory, explored in the study, Disenfranchisement, Historical Underpinnings, and Contemporary Manifestations, conducted by Brandy Blessed, explains how advantaged groups are perceived to be both powerful and have positively social constructs. Women's right in regard to their health follows in the same line of groups of people who foundationally have not been respected nor cared for in American history. Oppression through anti-abortion legislation is just one perspective of the disenfranchisement of women's health. It is known that current abortion legislation is influenced by a history of conservative politics and abortion activism, which ironically stems from the masculine ideology. The rise in conservative sexual politics that characterized the late 20th century influenced political attitudes and legislation in the U.S., including most major federal decisions surrounding abortion. This attests to the lack of privilege and right that women have over their own bodies. The sexualization of the woman's body has been deemed in society as having a negative connotation, something that isn't liberating or celebrated like male sexual presence.
Power and oppression in terms of women's health. Women are a group that has been oppressed for centuries in many arenas of our society. Though we have made a lot of progress in many of these arenas, women are still being disenfranchised, oppressed, and hold less power when it comes to our health and well-being, both within the medical field and throughout the scope of our government systems and institutions. One clear example of the oppression of women is in the politics of our healthcare system, especially surrounding abortion laws. Abortion laws have been a hot topic in the past couple decades, with passionate and convincing arguments coming from both sides. No matter one's personal beliefs about abortion, it is clear that anti-abortion laws are oppressing the rights of women to decide what they can or can't do to their own body. Roe v. Wade was an important case in the history of abortion rights because it decided in 1973 that the Constitution would protect a woman's right to decide to have an abortion or not. Over the years, this case has been challenged and fought by anti-abortion advocates, and other policies have come about that reduce access to abortions. Most of the time, the policymakers implementing these anti-abortion policies are men who have no concept of what it would be like to carry a child. Historically, women's opinions on abortion laws have not been taken into consideration. Even when abortions are legal, many states require permission for the procedure from the father of the child, taking away a woman's control of her own body. When abortions are illegal, women become so desperate for an abortion that they are forced to seek out doctors who will perform the procedure. Since these doctors aren't being regulated, they can charge outrageous prices, are often unsafe, unclean, and can cause women an array of other health issues. In this way, women are deprived of their basic rights of safety, choice, and free will. Reduced access to abortions has been found to disproportionately affect women of color and low-income women. Women may choose to have an abortion for a multitude of reasons, whether it be based on their mental or physical health, economic situation, or other reasons that would impact their ability to provide for a child. Unfortunately, other forms of institutionalized systemic oppression and racism have led to poverty and poor sexual education in minority populations. As a result, these women are disproportionately disadvantaged socially and economically, which makes anti-abortion laws even more detrimental to their health. There are many other forms of reproductive rights, including the right to plan a family, the use of contraceptives, and access to sexual education. A few of these relate to a form of systemic oppression within education systems. Many schools affiliated with religious organizations exert a form of systemic power and oppression by controlling the type of sexual education that is taught to the students. Many places still use abstinence-based education, which has been found to be unsuccessful and deprive students of adequate resources and knowledge about safe sex. It has been found in a variety of studies that in states with higher levels of stress on abstinence-based education, there are also higher rates of teen pregnancy. Schools and institutions exert power and control over the students by failing to properly educate them. Then the students are blamed for their mistake and often not given the choice to have an abortion. As we look for ways to improve the health and well-being of women, we turn toward a more recent approach, feminist ethics. Feminist ethics aims to understand, criticize, and correct how gender operates within our moral beliefs and practices. Feminist ethics focuses on the binary view of gender, the historical privilege of men, and how oppressive social orders or practices that harm others are maintained by our views on gender. Feminist ethics takes the intersectionality of multiple identities into consideration and has been very beneficial in the public health arena.
Power and privilege along the lines of race. Race versus racism. What is race? Race is the socially constructed meaning attached to a variety of physical attributes, including but not limited to skin and eye color, hair texture, and bone structure of people in the U.S. and elsewhere. Racism is the consciousness or unconsciousness, intentional or unintentional enactment of racial power grounded in racial prejudice by an individual or group against another individual or group perceived to have lower racial status. Different types of racism. Internalized racism lies within individuals. This refers to private beliefs and biases about race and racism. Interpersonal racism occurs between individuals. This bias that occurs when individuals interact with others. Institutional racism within institutions, for example, prisons, are policies, practices, and procedures in organizational cultures that work better for white people and work to determine of people of color, often unintentionally or inadvertently. Structural racism across society, the history and current reality of institutional racism across all institutions. This combines to create a system that negatively impacts communities of color. What is white privilege? It is a concept that highlights the unfair surgical advantages that white people have over non-white people. It is something that is pervasive throughout society and exists in all of the major systems and institutions that operate in society, as well as on interpersonal level. The term white privilege has a long history, but it has become the main focus since the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protest. The phrase white privilege was first coined by advocate and scholar Peggy McElhoish in 1988 in her paper, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Snack Shack. She described white privilege in terms of the unspoken advantage that the dominant culture has over people of color. In the simplest words, power, benefits, and other advantages are distributed in unequal ways among the different groups in society. Specifically with respect to white privilege, the advantage rests with white people. Peggy says that those of us who are white are born with a knapsack which contains all kinds of goodies, including educational opportunities, credit cards, blank checks, passports, and so on. The reality of the invisible knapsack is that if you are white, you can't take it off. It will be there until the day you die or the day systematic racism is ended. Meaning of white privilege. If you are white and have grown up feelings as though others have advantages over you, perhaps regarding your wealth, you might bristle at the notion that you are in some way privileged because of your race. White privilege is an advantage that protects white people against any form of discrimination related to their ethnicity and race. White privilege, however, does not imply that white people have not or cannot experience challenges in life. It means that any challenges that a white person has faced or may face is not related to the color of their skin. White privilege and power. White people have privilege because they have power. White power and privilege are completely tied together. They receive so much white privilege because they have the access to so much power in the society. Some used to think of privilege as a mere monetary issue. It is more than that. Yes, there are rich black and brown folks, but they are subject to racial profiling and stereotyping, especially because those that encounter them often don't know they're rich and so view them as decidedly not, as well as bias in mortgage lending and unequal treatment in schools. Triple jeopardy in the school system. Triple jeopardy, which is race, racism, and poverty, are social constructs that strikingly affect individuals' attitudes, not only those of disadvantaged groups, but from an advantaged perspective as well. The school-to-prison pipeline system is a system that essentially railroads minorities, youth, in particular Black Americans, through the triple jeopardy system. Essentially, there is a criminalization of Black youth, starting with the educational and juvenile justice system that promotes the incarceration of young adults at a higher risk of dropping out, explained by Hughes, Newkirk, and Stingham in the Reclaiming Children and Youth Journal. Through the practices of teachers and social workers who conspire ideologies and attitudes that perpetuate the triple jeopardy system, this overall introduces that school system is one of the first introductions of Black youth being thrown into a system of failure, where success is only equivalent to white children. This is a predecessor of how ultimately Black students see themselves socially and how their efforts in the world compared to their white counterparts will add up. Now to pass it to Javon to further explain the disenfranchised youth with the school-to-prison pipeline theory.
Thank you, Zinzele. The effect of intersectionality in our public school systems is nothing new. In fact, there is ample research indicating that various status, including race, gender, and income, work to impact achievement outcomes. This rings particularly true when considering the phenomenon known as the school-to-prison pipeline. The STPP refers to a system of practices employed by many schools where zero tolerance and exclusionary discipline models adversely impact short-term and long-term outcomes for students of color and males at a disproportionate rate. We'll have more on that later. In 2018, one literature review found that research has tied exclusionary practices to a host of negative student outcomes, including decreases in attendance, academic performance, and even graduation. Another adverse outcome is involvement with the criminal justice system. One longitudinal study that interviewed youth on an annual basis from 1997 through 2011 yielded the findings shown here for students who received suspensions during adolescence. Here we see, amongst other things, that school suspensions actually promote antisocial outcomes, increase the likelihood of interaction with the criminal justice system, and adversely impact African American males disproportionately. Infractions aside, for those able to avoid the trappings of the criminal justice system, there is still an effect associated with the school-to-prison pipeline. To say that the environment afforded by STPP culture is less than conducive for learning would be an understatement. Indeed, the increased security mechanisms embedded in many schools over the past decades works to set a tone for something other than academics. By no means does any of this make for a nurturing environment. Instead, it promotes a culture of strict conformity and harsh consequence for violation or insubordination. If this sounds familiar, it should. In the 1980s, the US government launched its war on drugs, which led to the adoption of harsh criminal policies in the 1990s. These policies have been found to disproportionately impact people of color. Similarly, there was a flurry of education reform policy that went into effect around the same time. Included in these were the zero tolerance and exclusionary discipline policies, the integration of school resource officers, as well as other provisions that work to create what we recognize as the school-to-prison pipeline today. The long-term effects of this are pronounced. Research has established significant systemic discrimination embedded in the STPP, just a portion of which are highlighted here. Minoritized youth are often the most frequently targeted, and as you can see, their future aspirations of being productive, contributing members to society, as well as their overall health and well-being, are greatly threatened by the mere existence of the STPP. So what can we do? A collective of social scientists, medical professionals, and student advocates have made myriad recommendations as to how to begin to address this issue. Here are just a few. Greater representation in the school education system will not only model potential career paths for underrepresented students, but also work to decrease discriminatory practices that still remain prevalent in many districts. Pivoting away from exclusionary policies such as suspension and expulsion and toward restorative policies such as research and response essays is the preferred method for redirecting students towards more positive behaviors. As an aside, the word discipline is derived from the Latin word discipulus, meaning pupil. That means that at its core, discipline is meant to teach and not punish. Lastly, we need to normalize mental health and fund it appropriately. The Safe Schools Act of 1994 and 1998 amendments to the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act increased the presence of school resource officers in schools, but did so at the cost of some wellness programs which had to be defunded. Increasing the presence of medical health professionals in schools will promote alternatives to suspension, provide better support to students with disabilities, and reduce the stigma associated with mental and psychological health maintenance. In summation, the effects of the school-to-prison pipeline loom large and are long-term as well as wide-reaching. School-to-prison pipeline impacts graduation rates, earning potential, the health of the individual, as well as that of the community. Having been a prevalent issue for nearly 30 years, it is unrealistic to assume that any one act could curtail its effect. However, as mentioned earlier, there is a multifaceted strategy that can be employed. We've got a lot of work to do, but as the saying goes, a 1,000-mile journey begins with one step. With that in mind, it's only fitting that we put on our walking shoes. Up next is Dalton with the psychological impacts of disenfranchisement.
So when it comes to the disenfranchised and mental health, there are several barriers that can prevent them from accessing mental health resources, such as insurance coverage. The insurance might not cover the ability to see a doctor to help with mental health. It might just be for like a dentist and eyesight and more physical sicknesses. So it can be more expensive to pay for those costs out of pocket. Geographical locations are another barrier. If they live outside of the city and they need to get to the city but they don't have a car, it can be difficult for them to find transportation to access the actual mental health facility itself. And then of course, stigma. In a lot of different communities, there's a negative stigma with mental health, and that can prevent people from reaching out to their friends and family and kind of getting the support and help they need to reach the mental health facilities. And so some ways to overcome these barriers and gaps to mental health one of them is collaborative care. So it's team-based primary care physicians that focus on the patients. There's mental health practitioners, there's managers, psychiatrists, and they all kind of work together to create a cohesive mental health unit to help the disenfranchised. There's patient-centered medical homes. So those people who work there are trained to treat the entire person, including their behavioral needs, social services, and they will provide that help regardless of one's ability to pay. The Mental Health Gap Action Program is created by the World Health Organization. It has guidelines for non-specialist health workers to kind of create that help for mental health, even if they're not specialized in it, and that way more people can be trained to help mental health businesses and organizations. It may not be as specialized, but it can still help the patient. And then a cost-effective option is group therapy. It's a more general kind of mental health initiative where lots of people are being worked with at once, but because of that, it creates lower costs. And then there's also telemental health, which solves the transportation issue, but it runs into the finance issue where if someone doesn't have access to internet or a phone or consistent service, it's kind of hard to have that discussion over the phone if it keeps cutting out or they're not even able to make the call. And then going back to the source, kind of putting more emphasis on psychiatry and medical school to get more students interested in it, so then there's more doctors, and students studying this material, and then in turn fills up more job openings, and then with an increase in practices of psychiatry, there will be more opportunities for people to access mental health institutions.
Reevaluating disenfranchisement in previously explored communities. Before speaking on disenfranchisement in the two particular groups, it is important to understand that disenfranchisement stems from discrimination in a system that is bred in the struggling of many individuals and groups that have compounded inequalities and lack of power, that which in the very foundations of American society and privilege for those of the advantaged group. Discussed by Javon and Doughton when discussing the youth of minorities in regards to the prison to pipeline system, exploring the statistical research as well as the psychological effects that an oppressive system has on the particular group. An estimated of 2.5% of Americans, or 6.1 million voters, fall under the category of being disenfranchised because of the past felony convictions that have grassroots in the SPPS, or school to prison pipeline system. This impact, which predominantly affects Black people, can be traced through systematic racism dating back to the Reconstruction era, and more recently, the war on drugs. As a whole, disenfranchisement is a double-edged sword that harbors psychological trauma as well as creates real issues systematically regarding socioeconomic resources and many basic rights and privileges. On the other hand, the advantaged group prospers but falls more and more out of reality, with how the mistreatment and created image through propaganda of the disadvantaged group is the root of the issue. The system was built to serve those who created it, and their personal best interest is principally how society will operate. Propaganda, when used to justify discriminatory behavior, is true violence, and the Black youth in the school to prison pipeline system and women of all status still can be told what to do and how to do it, even when the rest of society can live within themselves in privilege.